We move on to Imre Galambos, who I hope is also online and joining us from Spain. Imre is a professor of Chinese in the East Asian Studies Division of the University of Cambridge. He studied for several years in China and Hungary before attending UC Berkeley, where he received his PhD, writing his dissertation on the orthography of Chinese writing during the Warring States period. Shortly after that, he began working with IDP at the British Library, where I got to know him very well. After 10 years, he left to join the faculty at Cambridge University. Professor Galambos's research interests include medieval China, Dunhuang studies, and the history of Chinese writing, as well as the contacts between China and Central Asia. His major publications include Manuscripts and Travelers, a book that we wrote together, and I have to thank Imre for convincing me of what I thought was a crazy idea of dedicating a whole book to a single scroll. I think it turned out well in the end. He more recently wrote Translating Chinese Tradition and Teaching Tangut Culture, and Dunhuang Manuscript Cultures in 2020.
Thank you very much for the warm introduction. And we did get to know each other very well, that's true, and wrote a book together, which was fascinating, a fascinating experience. And I'm very happy to be here again at the British Library virtually, and be talking about a Lotus Sutra manuscript that I've been working with lately. So this is a manuscript that actually I wrote about in my previous book, but since then things progressed and I found other pieces of it. And so it's quite interesting because it's in a codex format, so this booklet format that consists of several gatherings or signatures or quires. And as you can see that there are 4 quires here, you can see them as they are basically individual booklets sewn together into a single manuscript. And what you see here on the front is really the text of the 25th chapter of the Lotus Sutra. So the text that's known in Chinese as the Guanyin Jing. And this is only one of the texts in this booklet. So in reality, there are a total of 10 texts in it, and we only have about half of the Lotus Sutra. And once the Lotus Sutra ends, there are other texts that come after it, a total of 9 different texts. And at the end of this little booklet, on the back cover, there is a date, the Gengcheng Nian, 12月20日, so the 20th day of the 12th month of the Gengcheng year, which would correspond to 921. And this date 921 is basically based on the fact that it's a cyclical year that repeats every 60 years, and these kinds of codices predominantly, or probably almost always, date to the 10th century. And so we think that this Gengcheng year dates to 921, possibly 981, but more likely 921. So we have a date here. As you can see, the last text here that you see is the text of the Heart Sutra, another very, very popular and very short scripture, which is found in Dunhuang, mostly in 10th century Dunhuang, which fits very well with the context of the book form, so this codex form. Now, all of these texts in this manuscript are very short, and the only longer text is really this 25th chapter of the Lotus Sutra, of which we miss the first half, or maybe a little more than the first half. And if you calculate the amount of text that's missing, it appears that one single quire is missing, because every quire or signature has 8 bifolia, so 8 folded sheets, making 32 pages. So if you fold them, then it becomes 16 leaves, and then each leaf has 2 pages. So there's a total of 32 pages for each of these quires, and one of them is missing. What's also very interesting, and I've wrote about this before, is that this booklet, similar to many other booklets from Dunhuang, was probably used in the context of commemorating the dead. So as part of mourning rituals, copying texts for the sake of the deceased. And the texts are copied by several individuals, not only in this booklet, but in many other booklets. So they're short texts, and there are several hands involved. In this case, more than 5 hands copied the text. And based on this manuscript and several others, I initially thought that these would probably be family members. And occasionally for a longer text, you might have had a hired hand involved. So those longer texts are typically written in a better handwriting than some of the other ones. In this case, even the short texts are written in a relatively confident and good handwriting, though. So basically, if we look at the structure of this manuscript, then we can see that we have these 4 quires that are present. So 1, 2, 3, 4, all of them have 8 leaves, 8 bifolio folded in half. And then we have one missing that's simply not part of this booklet. And if we go back to the picture, we can see that it's very easy that actually this the one quire would be disattached or detached from this collection, because they're basically sewn together using a thread, and this thread in places is coming apart. You can see here that this thread is white or kind of colorless, but in places it includes like green and red color. And since it's not really intact, so it's in a bad shape already, I'm guessing this is the original thread, because there's always the possibility that the thread was added at the British Museum at some point, and then today we actually don't know whether this is a 1,000-year-old thread or a 90-year-old or 70-year-old thread. But in this case, I think this is the original one. So that thread that kept the first quire together with the rest of the manuscript was detached, and that's how we are missing it today. And just by browsing some of the publications, I was fortunate enough to find another leaf or another bifolio from the same manuscript. And this was in the Russian collection in St. Petersburg. And as you can see, this is basically the outer bifolio of this missing quire. So you have the text of the Lotus Sutra, of the 25th chapter of the Lotus Sutra, and going on both sides, and then one of the sides represented the original front cover of the entire manuscript. So not only of this one quire, but all of the 5 quires together. And if you put it next to the our manuscript S5531 from the British Library, then you can see that the text continues seamlessly, and the handwriting is also the same. But you can basically just continue reading this last line. So 即限制金刚身而为说法. So that's basically the exact same sentence. It's very clear that these 2 quires, or these 2 pages even, were next to each other. And if we look at the other side, we can see the front and the back cover of this original manuscript. So this is now the 5th quire, or originally in manuscript S5531, it's the 4th quire. But since one is missing, and It was originally the fifth quire, the back of the fifth quire, and this is the very beginning of the first quire. So these are the two covers of this original manuscript. This text on the these three lines on the back of this booklet were actually written by Stein's secretary, so they're not part of the original manuscript, but were added in 1907. So it's a modern edition. It's kind of just describing the content of this booklet with some mistakes in it. So now basically we have the four quires, and we have this outer bifolio of the first quire. So I marked it with red, and you can see that the other gray lines represent the other bifolio that we don't have, which is not entirely true because, again, just looking at some manuscripts, I was able to find yet another piece of the same manuscript. And this is in the Tibetan collection of the Paleo collection. So it's Paleo Tibetan 1262 from Paris. And it's basically the same, part of the same manuscript. And it is also part of the same text. And it doesn't connect immediately to any of the other pieces because there are parts that are still missing in between. But it's very clear from the shape of the manuscript, and also from the shape of these leaves, which have this little arch on the top and also a little arch on the side, that this is the same. This is part of the same manuscript originally. Another thing that kind of makes us or tells us that we're on the right track here is the distance of the sewing station. So the sewing holes in the manuscript, which match perfectly well the pattern that we see in S5531 and also in the Russian text. And actually, just stepping back for a second to the Russian text here, we see these, some amount of grease that's here. So stains, grease stains, and actually these grease stains are also, as you can see, they're symmetrical. So they're showing there's a little bit up here on both sides, and there's a little bit here. So that's a very clear indication that these stains were not added to the manuscript after it became detached, but were part of the original, were still part of the original manuscript when all the quires were together. And maybe we can see the same grease stains, but they're more reduced because we are several layers away from the outer part of the quire where the grease stain is thicker, but still in the center, we still have the same stains on a smaller scale. So that helps us to kind of to confirm our suspicion that this was part of the same manuscript. And what's interesting here, obviously, what you notice immediately is that there are Tibetan sound glosses next to the Chinese characters. And quite interestingly, these are 3 sheets. So basically that amounts to 6 6 folio, that is 12 pages in total. So of the 12 pages in total, we only have the first page, so the front of this package, basically this 3 bifolio package. Only on the front page do we have the Tibetan sound glosses. And scholars have obviously noticed this, and they've spent a great deal of attention or allocated a great deal of attention to this manuscript, because it was quite interesting how the Tibetan letters were recording Chinese sounds. So linguists have used this manuscript extensively for reconstructing the pronunciation of local Chinese, so the Hexi dialect of Chinese in the 9th and 10th centuries. But I think this was one of the these Tibetan sound glosses is one of the reasons why this manuscript, which was originally part of the Chinese collection, it was moved into the Tibetan collection. So it became Paleo-Tibetan. And that's an interesting kind of decision, because of the 12 pages, 11 pages are in Chinese, and the manuscript is originally in Chinese, and only there are a few sound glosses here. But that was enough to kind of categorize it, declassify it, and reclassify it as a Tibetan manuscript. But what that triggered was that scholars working on Chinese manuscripts were perhaps less likely to see this manuscript. And when the Chinese collection of manuscripts in the Dunhuang collection at the BNF was published, this manuscript was not published because it was not part of the Chinese collection, which means that fewer people saw it, and so nobody until now has realized that this was part of another relatively well-known manuscript. Here are the two. We can compare a page in S5531 from the British Library, and then a page from this manuscript in the Paleo collection. And you can see that the hand is different. I think the Paleo manuscript has two different hands, and the hand that connects to the Chinese, the hand that connects to the Stein manuscript is the same, but before that, and that's what we see here on the right-hand side, there's a different hand, which works perfectly well with kind of what we see in most of S5531, which contains at least 5 different hands. So it's perfectly all right if there is yet another hand in the first quire. Okay, so this is what we had before, and now with the Paleo-Tibetan manuscript, we have an additional 3 bifolia or 6 folia from this original quire. So we're still missing the 4 bifolia, that is 8 folia, 8 leaves from the original quire. And it's not unlikely, I mean, it's quite possible that we can find them if somebody starts looking for these. That's perfectly plausible, because we found another 2 fragments of the same manuscript. And so what's missing now is basically equal from the first quire, is equal to what we found already. And with regards to the Tibetan sound glosses, it's actually also very interesting that they are next on the right-hand side of the Chinese characters, and they are aligned the same way as the Chinese text. And this is different from, say, this famous other manuscript with the Qianziwen, so the 1,000-character classic, where the Tibetan is written sideways. And that, to me at least, that what that entails is that to read the Tibetan, you would have to turn the manuscript 90 degrees counterclockwise, and then you could read the text, the Tibetan text, continuously. So you could recite this text without having to look at the Chinese characters. Now, with our Lotus Sutra manuscript, we can see that this is quite different, because the Tibetan text is not continuous. So the Tibetan text is simply annotating the Chinese. It's providing sound glosses to each Chinese character. And what that means is that you cannot continuously read horizontally the Tibetan characters, but you would kind of read them character by character, so syllable by syllable, along with the Chinese text. So in a sense, this, I think, precludes somebody simply reciting the text in Chinese by reading the Tibetan sounds. So instead, what's happening here is that somebody's almost like as if somebody was learning to read Chinese characters. And so the sounds added here are probably more related to learning rather than reciting this text, which is strangely in contrast with this, with the 1,000-character classic, which we would expect less to be recited, but obviously it was recited. And the Guanyin Sutra on the right-hand side was not recited in that sense. And one more thing that corroborates this assumption is that it's only these Tibetan sound glosses are only in the first page. So if somebody was to recite this text, and it was important to recite it as part of a ritual or something, then they could have added Tibetan sound glosses onto the second page and third page, but this did not happen. So we only have a single page, almost as if somebody was just practicing transcribing Chinese characters, writing down their sound. Okay, so this way we basically were able to reconstruct the original manuscript to a much larger degree. And this habit of, or this practice of piecing together detached fragments is one of the new developments in Chinese scholarship when working with manuscripts. It's called the 缀合, so the piecing together the fragments. But I think other than just piecing together the fragments, it actually allows us to see something more about the life of this manuscript. So there are different stages here. 1 minute left. Wow, okay. So basically we have the original stage when the booklet was created as part of the morning ritual, and the texts were copied, and the texts were not even copied the same exact time. So there might be weeks or even months apart from them and involving several people. So that was a stage in the life of a manuscript. And then the booklet continued to be used beyond the original ritual. And we know that because it fell apart at one point, and that becomes kind of the second and the third stage in the life of the booklet. And then at yet another point, somebody adds Tibetan sound glosses to the first page of Paleo-Tibetan 1262. And that's at a different point. And that's at a point where those three bifolia are already detached and are separate. So we know that it could not have happened during the second or third stage. So it must have been a fourth stage. And then, of course, these separate pieces are collected and deposited in the cave together. So this becomes, from our point of view, perhaps the last stage of the development of this manuscript. And so I think this example kind of gives us, well, it shows how manuscripts were not just created in a single point of time, but after that period, other people would have continued to use the manuscript for entirely different reasons, not just recycling the text, not just recycling the manuscript or the paper, like adding Tibetan glosses. The person who did that was not reusing the paper, was not using the blank spaces to write Tibetan letters, but he was actively engaging with the content of the original manuscript. So there was and my whole point here is that there is in the life of a manuscript, there is this original point where it's created, but then it continues on for decades and perhaps even a century or more. So thank you.